Sometimes the person you dismiss in the morning becomes the person who decides your future before sunset. Officer Ethan Walker couldn't stop staring at the woman sitting at the head of the conference table. The entire room had gone silent. 20 officers sat frozen in their chairs while a giant screen behind her displayed the words New Division Commander Orientation. Ethan's face slowly lost its color. His heartbeat pounded inside his ears as a single thought echoed through his mind. No. This can't be happening. Just 3 hours ago he had laughed at her. 3 hours ago he had treated her like she didn't belong. 3 hours ago he thought she was just another black woman wandering into a place reserved for people with authority. But now authority was staring directly back at him. Commander Naomi Carter sat perfectly still. Her navy blazer was simple. Her hands rested calmly on the table. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trying to embarrass him in front of everyone. Somehow that made the situation even worse. Because Ethan suddenly realized something terrifying. She had been calm the entire time. The room remained silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody dared to break the tension hanging in the air. Ethan swallowed hard as Captain Daniel Brooks slowly stepped beside Naomi. His voice was steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to officially introduce Commander Naomi Carter, your new commanding officer." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Around him, several officers straightened their posture immediately. Others exchanged nervous glances. But Ethan couldn't look away from Naomi. She was looking directly at him. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Just with quiet recognition. Imagine standing there while every decision you made over the last 3 hours suddenly replays inside your head. Every comment. Every assumption. Every moment you thought nobody important was watching. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. He could almost hear his own words echoing back at him. He remembered stopping her in the lobby. He remembered the dismissive smile. He remembered assuming she was lost. The memory alone made his chest tighten. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to working with all of you." Her words were simple, but the room somehow grew heavier. Because everyone could feel it. This wasn't just another leadership change. Something bigger was happening. Something none of them could see yet. Naomi folded her hands together and glanced around the room before her eyes briefly returned to Ethan. Some people believe a badge gives them permission to decide who belongs and who doesn't. But leadership isn't about deciding who matters. It's about protecting the dignity of every person who walks through these doors. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. A cold wave of regret crawled through his body. He had no idea how much trouble he was already in. What he didn't know was that today wasn't only Naomi Carter's first day as commander. Today was also the beginning of a complete internal review of the entire department. And before the sun went down, Ethan Walker was about to learn that the woman he had chosen to humiliate was never the wrong person. He was the wrong officer. And this was only the beginning. 3 hours earlier, Richmond Police Department was operating like it always did. Fast-moving on the surface and quietly divided underneath. Phones rang endlessly. Computer screens glowed across crowded desks. Officers walked past one another carrying coffee cups and unfinished reports while the early spring rain tapped softly against the windows. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, something invisible had already begun to shift. Officer Ethan Walker leaned back in his chair near the front lobby, completely unaware that this would become the most important day of his career. At 38 years old, he had spent 15 years building a reputation for being efficient, outspoken, and impossible to challenge. Some officers admired him. Others simply learned to stay quiet around him. He enjoyed being the loudest voice in the room. He enjoyed being the person who decided who belonged and who did not. Across the station, Officer Mia Rodriguez reviewed paperwork while occasionally glancing toward the entrance. There was an unusual energy in the building that morning. New leadership was arriving, but very few people knew any details. Captain Daniel Brooks had intentionally kept everything confidential. He wanted people to act naturally. He wanted to observe the culture exactly as it existed before introducing the new commander. Then the front doors opened. A woman entered carrying a simple leather portfolio. Commander Naomi Carter walked inside without any fanfare. No security detail. No formal introduction. No announcement. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She took a moment to observe the station before walking toward the reception desk. She noticed everything. The expressions on people's faces. The conversations that suddenly lowered in volume. The officers who greeted others warmly, and those who ignored certain people entirely. Imagine walking into a room where nobody knows your title, your accomplishments, or the years of experience behind your quiet confidence. Imagine knowing that every interaction will reveal more about them than it ever will about you. Naomi had spent 20 years leading complex investigations and building teams across multiple cities. She had learned something important long ago. People reveal their true character when they believe nobody important is watching. Ethan noticed her immediately, not because she demanded attention but because she did not. She moved with a kind of stillness that made him uncomfortable. He watched her approach the front desk before exchanging a quick glance with another officer nearby. Then he smirked. "Here we go again," he muttered under his breath. Naomi politely asked where she could find Captain Brooks. Ethan stood up before the receptionist could answer. He walked over with an expression that looked more amused than helpful. "Captain Brooks is a busy man," he said. "You cannot just wander in here expecting access to senior leadership." Naomi looked directly at him. Her expression did not change. She simply nodded once. "I understand," she said calmly. Ethan folded his arms. "The station is not a public tour. If you have business here, you should state it." Around them, a few officers pretended not to watch, but everyone was listening. Naomi remained composed. She held her portfolio close and quietly replied, "I am exactly where I need to be." Ethan laughed softly and shook his head. The confidence. That was what bothered him most. She was not intimidated. She was not apologizing. She was not trying to prove herself. And for reasons he could not explain, that irritated him more than anything else. Naomi stood quietly near the reception desk while the station continued moving around her as if nothing unusual was happening. But she could already sense the invisible lines dividing people inside the building. Some officers offered polite smiles to everyone they passed while others carefully chose who deserved their attention. It was a pattern she had seen many times throughout her career. A culture does not reveal itself during speeches. It reveals itself in ordinary moments when people think their behavior has no consequences. Ethan Walker leaned against a nearby desk with his arms crossed, his confidence growing every second that Naomi remained silent. He glanced at Officer Mia Rodriguez and gave a small laugh. "Some people walk into a police department and think they can just make demands," he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Mia did not respond. She simply lowered her eyes back to her paperwork. Naomi remained composed. She looked around the station once more before calmly saying, "I was only asking for directions." Ethan shook his head with a smile that carried more judgment than humor. "You would be surprised how many people wander in here expecting special treatment." Naomi nodded slowly. "I do not expect special treatment." Ethan chuckled and pointed toward a row of chairs along the wall. "Then maybe you should wait over there until someone is available." The room grew quieter than before. A few officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody intervened. Imagine standing there while strangers decide who you are before asking a single question about your story. Imagine knowing you have every reason to defend yourself, yet choosing silence because silence can reveal far more than arguments ever will. Naomi walked to the waiting area. Exactly as Ethan suggested. She sat down, placed her portfolio beside her, and quietly observed the station. She noticed an officer helping an elderly woman fill out paperwork. She noticed another officer greet a local school principal with genuine warmth. But she also noticed how quickly people followed the behavior of the loudest voice in the room. Ethan returned to his desk feeling victorious. To him, this was another ordinary interaction. Another moment where he had established control over his environment. He did not realize someone else was studying him just as carefully. Naomi had already memorized his nameplate, his demeanor, and his tendency to speak before understanding a situation. She was not angry. In fact, she looked remarkably peaceful. That was because she was not there to win an argument. She was there to understand the system she had been sent to lead. At that exact moment, Captain Daniel Brooks was upstairs preparing documents for the official announcement. He paused when he looked through a small security monitor and sighed quietly. He had hoped things would unfold differently, but perhaps this was necessary. Sometimes the truth about a workplace arrives before leadership ever does. Back downstairs, Ethan walked past Naomi once more. "You are still here," he said. Naomi looked up at him and gave a polite smile. "Yes, I am." Ethan laughed softly. "Persistent too. That is interesting." Naomi replied in a steady voice. "Sometimes persistence is necessary when something important needs to change." Ethan shrugged without thinking much about her words. If only he knew how true they were. Because hidden inside Naomi's leather portfolio was not only her appointment paperwork, but also the first stage of a department-wide cultural assessment, authorized by city leadership. By the end of the day, every assumption Ethan had made would become part of a much larger story. A story that was already unfolding right in front of him, while he remained completely unaware. The clock on the wall read 9:23 in the morning, but to Naomi Carter every minute inside Richmond Police Department was already revealing years of hidden habits. She sat quietly in the waiting area while officers moved around her, some avoiding eye contact and others pretending she was invisible altogether. The rain outside had become heavier now, creating a soft rhythm against the windows that somehow made the silence inside the station even more noticeable. Ethan Walker walked back toward the coffee station and casually spoke to a few nearby officers. "You would think people would learn to make appointments before showing up at a police department," he said with a grin. A couple of officers gave uneasy smiles while Officer Mia Rodriguez remained silent. She could sense something was wrong, although she could not explain why. Ethan glanced toward Naomi again. She was still sitting calmly, reading a document from her portfolio without a hint of frustration on her face. That bothered him. He expected annoyance. He expected an argument. He expected her to defend herself. Instead, she simply existed with a level of confidence that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Ethan walked over once again. "Are you sure you are in the right place?" he asked. Naomi closed the folder gently and looked up. "I am certain." Ethan laughed softly. "Interesting. Most people would have left by now." Naomi offered a polite smile. "Sometimes staying is important when the place itself matters." Ethan shook his head as if her answer was ridiculous. "The place matters because of the people who work here," he said. Naomi nodded. "I agree with that." The answer was simple, but for some reason it felt heavier than anything else she had said all morning. Imagine sitting there while someone unknowingly explains exactly why they are about to face the consequences of their own behavior. Imagine hearing a person describe values they have already forgotten how to practice. Across the room, Officer Mia quietly observed the interaction. She had worked with Ethan for 6 years and had become accustomed to his attitude, but something felt different today. There was a strange calm surrounding Naomi that made everyone else appear louder than they really were. Upstairs, Captain Daniel Brooks finished reviewing a stack of files and took a long breath. On the top page was a document titled Department Culture Review Initiative. Beneath that title were several key objectives: professional conduct, public trust, internal accountability, inclusive leadership. Everything Naomi was about to evaluate had already been authorized by city officials weeks ago. Downstairs, Ethan leaned against a desk once more. "You know," he said, "this job is not for everyone. Some people come in thinking leadership is easy." Naomi stood up slowly and placed her portfolio under her arm. "Leadership is never easy," she replied. "It is a responsibility." Ethan smirked. "At least we agree on something." Naomi looked at him for a brief moment. Sometimes agreement is the easiest part. Living up to it is much harder. Before Ethan could answer, an announcement suddenly echoed through the station speakers. "Attention all personnel. Mandatory conference room meeting in 5 minutes." Ethan straightened his uniform immediately. Officers began gathering their papers and heading toward the hallway. Naomi remained perfectly still for a second before quietly following behind them. Nobody noticed the tiny gold nameplate attached inside her portfolio. Nobody except Officer Mia Rodriguez, whose eyes widened the moment she saw 2 words engraved beneath an official city seal. Commander Naomi Carter. Officer Mia Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken the moment she saw the nameplate, but she said nothing. She simply stared for half a second before lowering her eyes and following everyone else toward the conference room. Naomi Carter walked calmly behind the group, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged. Around her, officers chatted about schedules, reports, and patrol assignments, completely unaware that the woman they had ignored all morning was about to become the most important person in the building. Ethan Walker walked ahead confidently, greeting coworkers and laughing as if nothing unusual had happened. In his mind, this was just another mandatory meeting before another ordinary workday. He had no reason to believe his world was already shifting beneath his feet. The conference room slowly filled with nearly 30 officers. Chairs scraped against the floor while coffee cups settled onto tables. A projector screen glowed softly at the front of the room. Ethan took his usual seat near the center, the place he always chose because it gave him the best view and often the most attention. Then he noticed Naomi quietly enter the room. He frowned immediately. "Why is she in here?" he whispered to the officer beside him. Nobody answered. Naomi walked to the front but did not sit down. Instead, she stood beside the presentation screen and waited. Ethan leaned back in his chair with an amused smile. He assumed she had accidentally followed the group into the wrong room. Imagine being so confident in your assumptions that you never stop to question whether you truly understand the person standing in front of you. Imagine discovering too late that every judgment you made was built on nothing more than your own imagination. Across the room, Captain Daniel Brooks finally entered carrying a folder in one hand. The room slowly grew quiet. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "Today marks an important transition for this department. We are entering a new chapter." Ethan folded his arms and listened without much interest. Leadership changes happened all the time. But then Captain Brooks continued. Over the last year, city officials have conducted extensive reviews regarding culture, trust, and long-term department performance. We have selected someone uniquely qualified to lead this next phase. Ethan sat up slightly. Naomi remained perfectly still beside the screen. Captain Brooks smiled warmly before stepping aside. "Please welcome your new commanding officer, Commander Naomi Carter." The room instantly fell silent. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Several officers widened their eyes while others straightened their posture. Ethan stared at Naomi in disbelief as dozens of memories from the past 3 hours flooded his mind at once. Every dismissive comment, every assumption, every unnecessary remark. Naomi looked around the room with calm confidence before speaking. "Thank you, Captain Brooks." Her voice was steady and reassuring. "I am honored to serve alongside every one of you." She paused for a moment and let the silence settle. Then she added something that made Ethan's stomach tighten. "Even more. Before leadership begins, listening must come first. That is why today has already been incredibly informative." Her eyes briefly met Ethan's. Not with anger, not with revenge, just with understanding. Somehow that felt heavier than any punishment he could imagine. Because Ethan suddenly realized that while he had spent the entire morning judging her, she had spent the entire morning learning exactly who he was. The room remained silent long after Naomi finished speaking. Even the soft hum of the projector seemed louder now. Ethan Walker sat completely still, trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in years, he could not think of a clever response. He could not lean on his confidence. He could not laugh his way through the situation. Because deep down, he knew something had changed. Naomi Carter was no longer a stranger sitting in the lobby. She was now the person responsible for leading the entire department. Naomi walked slowly across the front of the room, her hands resting comfortably at her sides. She did not carry herself like someone trying to establish dominance. Instead, she projected something far more powerful. Stability. "I believe trust is built through everyday actions," she said. "The way we treat each other inside this building eventually becomes the way we treat the communities we serve outside of it." Several officers nodded quietly. Others listened with genuine curiosity. Ethan remained frozen in his chair. Every sentence felt strangely personal now. Naomi continued speaking. "Over the next few weeks, we will begin a department-wide assessment. Not to punish people, not to embarrass anyone, but to identify opportunities for growth." She paused and looked around the room. Great departments are not built by fear. They are built by accountability. Imagine realizing that the smallest choices you make every day are quietly creating the future you will eventually have to face. Imagine discovering that every casual comment, every assumption, And every moment of disrespect leaves behind a trail that somebody will eventually notice. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He suddenly remembered every interaction he had that morning. Naomi had never once raised her voice. She had never argued. She had never tried to expose him in front of everyone. Instead, she had done something far more unsettling. She had listened. Captain Daniel Brooks smiled from the side of the room. He had worked in law enforcement for 30 years, and he understood something many people forgot. Character always reveals itself before authority ever does. Naomi clicked a button on the presentation remote, and a new slide appeared. Department priorities: professionalism, respect, community trust, internal leadership development. The room became even quieter. Then Naomi added one final point: human dignity. She looked around carefully before speaking again. Every person who walks through our doors deserves to be treated with respect. That includes citizens, visitors, co-workers, and people we have never met before. Ethan felt his face grow warm. He could not tell whether anyone else understood what she was referring to, but he certainly did. Officer Mia Rodriguez glanced toward him briefly before looking away again. She was not judging him. She was simply witnessing a lesson unfold in real time. Then Naomi said something that made the entire room stop breathing for a second. Sometimes leadership begins before people know who you are. The way we treat strangers often reveals how we will eventually treat those with authority. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. That sentence landed harder than anything else she had said all morning, because he finally understood. This had never been a test she created. It was a test he had unknowingly given himself, and he had already failed before she ever introduced her name. The meeting ended, but nobody stood up immediately. Officers remained in their seats for a few extra seconds, almost as if they were trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The atmosphere inside the conference room felt completely different now. Earlier that morning, people had walked through the station on autopilot, following routines they had repeated for years. Now, every conversation seemed more thoughtful. Every movement seemed more deliberate. Ethan Walker slowly gathered his notebook, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. For the first time in a very long time, he did not know how to carry himself. Confidence had always been his shield, but today that shield suddenly felt very fragile. Naomi Carter stood near the projector screen speaking quietly with Captain Daniel Brooks. She looked exactly the same as she had looked in the lobby. Calm, professional, unshaken. It was strange. Nothing about her had changed. The only thing that had changed was what people knew about her. Imagine realizing that a person's worth was never connected to their title at all. Imagine understanding that the respect they deserved existed long before you ever learned their name. Officers gradually exited the room while Naomi remained behind, greeting each person individually. Good morning, Officer Jenkins. Thank you for being here. Good morning, Officer Harper. I look forward to working together. Every interaction was sincere. Nobody felt ignored. Nobody felt insignificant. Then Ethan found himself standing at the end of the line. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. He approached carefully. His usual confidence was gone. His shoulders were lower than before. Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained all day. Good morning, Officer Walker, she said. Ethan hesitated before answering. Good morning, Commander Carter. The words felt strange leaving his mouth. Naomi nodded politely. Thank you for attending today's meeting. Ethan swallowed hard. There was something he wanted to say, but he could not find the words. Captain Brooks quietly stepped away, giving them space. Ethan finally spoke. I think I may have made some assumptions earlier. Naomi nodded once. Assumptions happen. Ethan looked surprised by her answer. She was not humiliating him. She was not trying to embarrass him in return. Somehow that made him feel even more uncomfortable. Naomi continued speaking. The important question is what we choose to learn from those moments. Ethan lowered his eyes. Around them, officers continued leaving the room while Officer Mia Rodriguez paused near the doorway. She watched silently, understanding that something bigger than a simple mistake was happening. This was not about one conversation anymore. It was about an entire culture. Naomi picked up her portfolio and prepared to leave the room. Before she walked away, she stopped and said something that would stay with Ethan for a very long time. People often tell me leadership changes organizations. That is not entirely true. People change organizations. Leadership simply gives them permission to become the best version of themselves. Then she smiled politely and walked toward her new office. Ethan stood there completely still. He suddenly realized that today was not the end of his embarrassment. It was the beginning of his responsibility. Because while everyone else had just met a new commander, Ethan had encountered something far more powerful. A mirror. And for the first time in years, he did not entirely like what he saw staring back at him. 3 months later, Richmond Police Department no longer felt like the same place. The hallways were still busy, the phones still rang, and officers still rushed from one assignment to another. But something deeper had changed. People greeted one another more often. New officers felt comfortable asking questions. Community members were welcomed with patience instead of suspicion. Trust had slowly replaced tension. On a bright Monday morning, Ethan Walker stood near the front entrance speaking with a group of local high school students visiting the station. His voice was calmer now. His posture was different. He listened more than he spoke. Across the room, Officer Mia Rodriguez smiled quietly as she watched the interaction. It was difficult to believe that only a few months earlier, this same building had operated under an entirely different mindset. Ethan noticed Naomi Carter walking through the lobby carrying a folder. He immediately stood a little straighter and approached her with genuine respect. "Good morning, Commander Carter," he said. Naomi smiled warmly. "Good morning, Officer Walker. How is the Community Partnership Program going?" Ethan smiled for the first time without forcing it. "Better than I expected. I am learning a lot." Naomi nodded. Sometimes growth begins the moment we realize we do not know everything. Ethan laughed softly. "I believe that now. Imagine discovering that the greatest lesson of your life came from one ordinary morning you almost forgot. Imagine understanding that a single moment of disrespect can become the beginning of a lifelong transformation if you are willing to learn from it." Nearby, several young visitors listened as officers explained their responsibilities. One little boy looked up and asked a simple